In a land far from the outside world, there were three powerful gods named Alpha, Omega, and Nu. They were sent down to a beautiful fantasy island where they established three kingdoms that flourished with life and magic. Alpha was the god of war, Omega was the god of elements, and Nu was the goddess of light and dark. For centuries, the three kingdoms lived in peace and prosperity, thanks to the guidance and protection of their divine rulers. But one fateful day, Nu began to go mad with power and sought to seize control of all three kingdoms. Her once benevolent intentions were twisted into a desire for absolute power and dominance. Alpha and Omega knew they had to act fast to stop Nu's destructive rampage. They fought valiantly against her army, but Nu's powers were too strong. In the end, they had no choice but to use a powerful spell to seal Nu away underground. However, the cost of the battle was immense, and Alpha and Omega had to enter a deep sleep to recover from their extreme energy loss. Many years passed and the kingdoms lived on, but they always remembered the fateful battle that took place. One day, as Alpha and Omega began to stir from their slumber, they were awakened by the sounds of war drums and battle cries. Nu's remaining army had launched an attack on the kingdoms, hoping to free their goddess from her imprisonment. Now, Alpha and Omega must rise again and defend the kingdoms they worked so hard to establish. The fate of the three kingdoms rests in their hands as they face off against Nu's army once more. As Alpha began to stir from his long slumber, he was struck by a sudden jolt of pain. His eyes flew open to see a ballista bolt embedded in the wall near his head. His kingdom was under attack. With a sharp intake of breath, Alpha leapt to his feet and surveyed the destruction around him. The once grand walls of his kingdom had been breached, and enemy soldiers were pouring in, their weapons glinting in the morning sun. Despite the chaos and destruction around him, Alpha remained calm and focused. He knew that he had to act quickly if he was going to save his kingdom and his people. With a roar, Alpha summoned all of his strength and unleashed a powerful wave of energy that sent the enemy soldiers flying. He charged forward, his sword flashing in the sunlight, and engaged the enemy in hand-to-hand combat. Despite the overwhelming odds against him, Alpha fought with all his might, never once backing down or faltering in his resolve. He was a god of war, and this was his element. As the battle raged on, Alpha could feel his strength beginning to wane. The energy lost from his previous battle with Nu was still taking its toll on him, but he refused to give up. He knew that the fate of his kingdom was at stake. With one final burst of energy, Alpha charged forward and took down the enemy leader, sending the rest of the soldiers fleeing in terror. As he stood there panting and covered in blood, he knew that the battle was far from over. But he was ready. He was Alpha, the god of war, and he would do whatever it takes to protect his kingdom and his people. As Omega opened his eyes, he was immediately struck by the chaos and destruction that surrounded him. His once mighty kingdom was in ruins, and he could hear the sounds of battle raging all around him. With a fierce determination, Omega rose to his feet and summoned his elemental powers to protect his people. He conjured up a massive gust of wind, sending his enemies flying back, and followed up with a searing blast of fire that sent them running for cover. But as the battle raged on, Omega could feel his energy beginning to wane. He knew that his powers were not as strong as they once were, and he was struggling to keep up with his enemies. Despite this setback, Omega refused to give up. He dug deep, summoning every last bit of strength he had to unleash a powerful barrage of lightning bolts that struck down his foes. As the last of his enemies fell, Omega collapsed to the ground, panting and exhausted. He knew that he had only narrowly managed to save his kingdom, and that he would need to work hard to regain his full strength. But Omega was not deterred. He was one of the most powerful gods on the island, and he would do whatever it took to protect his people and his kingdom from harm. With their armies in tatters and their kingdoms weakened, Alpha and Omega decided to meet at a trade outpost located in the land between their kingdoms. Accompanied by their 7 generals, they sat down to discuss their next moves. As they talked, it became clear that both Alpha and Omega had suffered significant losses during their battles. They had used up much of their energy and had depleted their armies to a dangerous level. But despite these setbacks, Alpha and Omega remained determined. They knew that they could not let their kingdoms fall, and they were willing to do whatever it took to defend their people. Together, they hatched a plan to pool their resources and work together to rebuild their armies and fortify their kingdoms. They would launch a coordinated counterattack against their enemies, striking back with all the strength they had left. And so, Alpha and Omega set out to lead their armies into battle once more, bolstered by their determination and their commitment to protecting their people. With their kingdoms in ruins and their futures uncertain, they knew that they would have to fight with everything they had if they were to emerge victorious.
This story was written in part using ChatGPT. All concepts were created by myself, Cheetah Links. Though the main story was composed through AI, the story was also read by Play.ht Studio using text-to-speech powered by AI. The art you see was generated by Night Cafe's AI art generator and in part by particular segments of the story. I thank all the developers of these platforms to help bring you this awesome story that may or may not pop back up. And big news, I have a Patreon. I co-own a small developing studio startup and would appreciate your support. You will be listed in all of my future videos and have exclusive access to our new games and content in the future. And if you don't want to pay, please consider subscribing and hitting that like button. It's free and you can change your mind at any time. Once again, thank you for watching.